Thanks for that, and great to be back. And I've got the unenviable problem of got to get a 40-50 minute session in about half an hour, so forgive me if I fly through it. As we said, we have been in discussions about doing like a webinar or something later on, so I've got no doubts that there will be people here who have got questions about what I'm about to say. As a bit of a background, the ED320 was launched 31st of March. You've got until the end of June to respond to it. It came out of the work done through the AASB Special Project for Fair Value in the Public Sector. I've been a member of that committee for the last 6 years, so it's taken 6 years to get to this point. For anyone who knows anything about exposure drafts in the AASB, provide your consultation, but by the time it's got to where it's got to now, it's pretty, it had to be a big significant change for them to change what they've said in there. That special project had people in it from everywhere. So we had audit officers involved, we had local government associations, we had people like myself and all the rest of it. And the background to it was created because of the significant, shall we say, non-compliance and inconsistency across the different jurisdictions. I mean, the first time I came down to Victoria to the FinPro conference was, I'm going to say 15 years ago. And I have an audit background, so I spent most of my career with Queensland Audit Office, used to look after the local government sector, and I was just astounded at some of the stories I was hearing in terms of the practices. And the reality is, if you go into state and you talk to the other local governments as to how they deal with stuff, you'll sit back and go, why are they doing that? Because it's so inconsistent with what we're doing in, say, Victoria or New South Wales or WA or Queensland. So the whole background of this is to get consistency, given that we are all working under the same accounting standard. One little thing I did want to stress here, the little red box there. Whilst this is an exposure draft, and what this means is that it's not formally approved until the AASB signs off on it, which I believe should be pretty quick. The reality is, for this exposure draft, it's not introducing anything new. It's actually a clarification of the existing standards and a little bit of additional Australian guidance. And even if you just say, oh, I've got some issues and I've got to transition to this, you've got basically 2 years to transition to it, but that doesn't stop you with early adoption. Okay. So in terms of ED320, there are 3 key areas that they've identified as key issues. So market participant assumptions, highest and best use, and application of the cost approach. The other thing is there, and this is the thing that frustrates me, from my perspective as someone who delivers valuations, or a company that delivers valuations, the inconsistency across the jurisdictions and all the issues that we're covering are all pretty much covered in the last 4 paragraphs of the ED. And that deals with things that this AASB have just said, the standard's black and white. There shouldn't be any problem here. But anyway, I'll go through it. So I'm going to jump first to the basis conclusions. And this is at the last little bit of the ED320. Please go and have a read of it if you haven't looked at it yet. These are not changes to the standard. So this is where the AASB has confirmed existing requirements, so they do not need to change. And the basis conclusions I'm about to go through provide clearer guidance about the existing requirements, as in they apply from now, right? This is not we wait till the ED320 has been approved and then go forward. This is saying the ED320 says there's no need to change the standard because the standard's already okay. Okay, first one, restricted assets. Dare I say it, this is a huge issue for Victoria. The existing practice adopted in Victoria, as well as, say, New South Wales and WA, says that the current, if I buy a piece of land and I use it to, say, build a road, or I acquire land and I'm going to use it as a cemetery or I'm going to use it as a park, the traditional practice in Victoria has been to say, oh, I've got to discount it because it's not at highest and best use. Whereas the AASB have been quite clear in this and consistent with some of the other jurisdictions like Queensland, for example, where they've said the standard actually says whatever, if you're a public sector entity, whatever you're using that asset for probably is its highest and best use. So theoretically, its value has to be equal to or greater than any other alternative use. So In Victoria, traditionally, the VGV has said, because it's now a park and you can't build on it, therefore its value has to be discounted. This is a fundamental change in philosophy. So the basic conclusion 151, and this is consistent with IFRS 13, which AASB 13 is based on, and it basically says you only take into account restrictions that would pass from the buyer to the seller. So the reality is, if a local government comes along and buys a piece of land or acquires a piece of land, turns it into a park, the normal practice is, in most jurisdictions, is that if you decide that you no longer want that piece of land, what you've got to do is turn it from community land into operational land. As a consequence of that, you then turn it into freehold. And normally, if you're going to divest yourself of that asset as a council, what are you going to do? You're going to change the zoning restrictions and building restrictions around it so that you can maximise your return when you sell it. So if you look at the history of local government, pretty much they're what we call land bankers, where they acquire land through developers or whoever, and then eventually down the track, the value of that land grows, and eventually they decide to sell it for some other purpose. So, if it's unlikely so only if it is absolutely sure that you're going to pass whatever that restriction is to a potential buyer, would you take that into account? So a good example might be if I've got an airport and around that airport I've got mangroves, which are an environmentally protected zone. That's a restriction that would pass from the seller to the buyer. And that would also have already been inherently in the value of the land before you acquired it. So if I look at it from a market value perspective, the market value of that land as a freehold land would already include that restriction in it. But because I use it as a park or a cemetery, well, no, that's a restriction that you wouldn't take into account. On the other side of it, it does say that, if that's a restriction that won't pass, it's not included. If it is a restriction that would be passed from the seller to the buyer, then that gets taken into account. So that's going to drive huge changes in some jurisdictions. What it means is no discount to be applied to the valuation of restricted assets unless the same restriction would pass to a hypothetical buyer. As I said before, it is very rare that situation would ever occur. When you sell, say, a motor vehicle, for example, to someone, you don't get to tell them what they can use that motor vehicle for. You've passed title, and it's up to them to do what they do with it. It's the same with land. And people will buy land. Good example for those who follow the Melbourne Storm, for example, often play football at Suncorp Stadium in Brisbane. Well, that used to be a cemetery. So just because something is a cemetery doesn't mean it can't be used for something else. Again, this is one of the other ones. And I kid you not, I nearly fell off my chair yesterday. I've been invited by a company based in India to do a valuation for the global properties for DFAT, for the Australian government. Their tender documentation came out, not only did it quote AASB 1031, with those who have a history in accounting sense know that was removed in 2013, but it also refers to doing the valuation in accordance with depreciated replacement cost. And I still see tenders coming out from local governments talking about DRC. DRC was removed from the standard in 2013. It was replaced with current replacement cost. And current replacement cost is fundamentally different than depreciated replacement cost. But we still see it. So ED 320 through BC 173 and 174 make it absolutely clear that if you're valuing your assets using a depreciated replacement cost approach, which it basically means I'm calculating a remaining useful life, dividing by the useful life, multiplying by the gross, that is DRC, and that is non-compliant with the accounting standard. Some of the participants in the process asked the AASB to clarify it, and what they said is there is no need to change the standard or to clarify it because it's already black and white. Paragraph B9 of AASB 13 very specifically says that when you do the cost approach, you start with the replacement cost, you then adjust for obsolescence to get to your fair value, to your current replacement cost. And that difference is an adjustment for obsolescence, B9 says it is conceptually different and much broader than depreciation expense. If you think about the accounting standards, useful life does not exist in AASB 13, neither does remaining useful life. Those concepts are encapsulated in AASB 116, which deals with depreciation expense. And very clearly, the AASB has said, why would you do it that way? It's got nothing to do with how you determine current replacement cost. Just on that, in terms of the model statements, and I see this all the time, because the Victorian model statements are based on the Australian accounting standards, and you have very few specific, shall we say, regulations that say you must apply certain policies. If you look at your model statements, they are generally based on the net disclosure method, which basically says you report your fair value, and then going forward you deduct future depreciation expense. But in the other jurisdictions, or most other jurisdictions, they adopt the gross disclosure method. So what they do is they show, this is my replacement cost. I then have an adjustment for accumulated depreciation, which then shows me my current replacement cost. Now, I've seen with a lot of Victorian local governments that you actually put CRC in the column for replacement cost, and then you put DRC in the column for fair value, which is wrong. If you're using gross disclosure, it's replacement cost, and then your fair value column is your current replacement cost. If you're using net disclosure, it's simply your current replacement cost less any future accumulated depreciation. So it's just a conceptual little thing. But the main thing here is, if your valuation is based on, a theoretical useful life, say 100 years, the age to date of the asset is 60 years, and you said, oh, therefore our valuation is 40/100ths, you are non-compliant with the accounting standard and fundamentally wrong. AASB 13 specifically requires paragraph 11 that when you're doing it, it's a market-based assessment and you take into account the key characteristics relevant to the market participants, and they are specifically listed as condition, location, restrictions. So I would dare suggest that there would be a lot of councils sitting here and going, shit, that's how we've always done it. It might be time to sit back and have a really good look at this and get some guidance as to how you do that. As I said before, the fundamental problem is you are basing the valuation on a depreciation expense concept as opposed to the key characteristics as specified in paragraph 11. And the AASB and AASB 13, IFRS 13 are quite explicit that conceptually it is not an adjustment for depreciation, it's an adjustment for obsolescence, which is conceptually different and much broader than depreciation. The other one, again, this is one of the last few paragraphs of the entire exposure draft, and this is a national issue, absolute national. So for those who know me, know I've been around for a long time. I spent 22 years with QAO before I moved to APV 16 years ago. So if you do your sums, you can probably work out how old I am, or thereabouts. But back in 1997, depreciation used to be covered by AAS4 depreciation. And in that, it used to say, prior to 1997, you should use a method which matches the pattern of consumption. But if you can't, because it's too hard, use straight line because it's simple. And in 1997, AAS4 was changed to remove any get-out-of-jail-free card for using straight line. And it said, it mandated you must use a method which matches the pattern of consumption. When we subsequently adopted the IFRS standards in 2006, the word must was changed with shall. But other than that, it's the same. And the AASB, in the looking of exposure draft ED320, said it's black and white. You should not be using straight lines as a default, particularly in terms of doing your valuation, because your valuation has to be based on the key characteristics relevant to market participants. From a valuation perspective, when you go and think about buying something like a house or a car or whatever it is, one of the first things you do is you think about what the condition of it is and what it would cost to bring it back to as new. That's how the market works. So as assets age and degrade at an ever-increasing pace, as well as the impact of obsolescence, what you would normally expect is that the valuation profile is probably not linear. It's probably not a straight line. It's nice and simple, I'll give you that, but it's probably not really reflecting what your true value is. So whatever that profile is that you've used to determine your fair value, you then depreciate the carrying amount down to the residual value over the remaining useful life using that method, that same pattern of consumption. So I guess coming out of this, I'm going to say you should not be adopting straight line as a default. Now, I know that for a lot of the jurisdictions in Australia, they effectively mandate it. I know that some of the audit officers effectively mandate it, and they put pressure on you to set your accounting policies for you. That is not the role of audit. At the end of the day, if you want the figures to be true and fair, you need to really think about what is the reality, how are my assets consumed? Because if you don't know that, that then casts dispersions as to the quality of your asset management planning. If you're making a whole range of assumptions that aren't reality, and then you're feeding that into your asset management plan, it's the old story, crap in, crap out. And if you want to do this properly, they should be fully integrated. So whatever profile you're using for your valuation, it should be consistent with the profile that you subsequently use for your depreciation. There are lots of different patterns of consumption. I'm not going to tell you go and use any particular one or that. It might be that you sit back and go, no, I am going to use straight line because that makes sense. That's fine, but you need to at least think about what is your pattern of consumption. The issue here, I suppose, is the black line is like a curve. If that's your valuation profile, and once you've come to a point where that dotted line intersects the curve, and you say, that's my fair value, through ED320, what you will see is that your depreciation expense must be calculated on your carrying amount down to your residual value over your remaining useful life. So when AASB 116 talks about useful life, it's not talking about useful life from original construction to time of death. Useful life under that standard is talking about where you are now to its remaining useful life. And this also comes out of Basic Conclusion 176. Again, national issue. A lot of the finance systems don't calculate it correctly. They calculate it by gross less residual over useful life, which is technically incorrect. The BC 176 makes reference to IAS 8. So International Accounting Standard 8 is the basis of AASB 108. In example 3 there, it just clarifies that if you're calculating depreciation expense, you'll see here this is for a revalued asset. At the bottom half of the screen, you'll see the results of the engineering survey. The new fair value is 17,000, residual value of 3,000, RUL 7 years, therefore depreciation expense is 17 less 3 divided by 7, which equals 2,000. It is not the gross replacement cost divided by the useful life. Now, the consequence of all of this, and this is the real scary bit, back in 2015, the AASB issued what they call the residual value decision. And what they said is, if I have got a component of an asset like a roof, and my typical renewal treatment is to replace that roofing iron after 50 years, but I've still got the underlying trusses and battens and insulation and that underneath that roof. If the cost of the renewal treatment is less than the cost of the overall component, then I have two different parts with two different useful lives, and they have to be depreciated separately. So the AASB refer to as the short life and long life parts, or the renewal part and the recyclable part. The implication of this means, because your depreciation is your fair value, or your carrying amount less residual over your RUL, from a valuation perspective, the valuer needs to provide you with a fair value for the short life and long life parts of each component. Right? And I know some people are sitting there going, oh, Jesus, this is getting too hard. Trust me, it's not. It just means a bit of a tweak to methodology and some of the calculations. But it will be a big implication, because a lot of the valuation firms out there have got no idea about this. Absolutely none. Okay. Now, the three other bits that were in the standard, market participant assumptions, again, paragraph F4. So F refers to Australian guidance. It basically says, if you've got observable market evidence, you must use that. If you haven't got that, then you can make up your own assumptions effectively. So paragraph F5, if all relevant information about market participants' assumptions available, then use it, otherwise use your own. Highest and best use, and again, this is what I touched on before with restricted assets. So this is a huge divergence, particularly for Victoria, New South Wales and WA. What it basically says is if I've got a park, another local government would probably also have a park, that's financial feasible and therefore that's highest and best use. And you can only rebut it if there is a confirmed commitment by the council to do something with that piece of land, right? So that we work on the basis, whatever you're using it for, it's a park, it's a cemetery, it's state forest, whatever it is, it's a road corridor, that's its highest and best use. There is no adjustment or discounting from what the market value would be, because those restrictions are entity specific and would not pass from the seller to the buyer. And if getting to the end, so I'm just conscious of time. We're trying to make sure we've got time here for the Lord Mayor. Application of the cost approach, again, a big issue for Victoria. I still know a lot of Victorian councils still refer to greenfield and brownfield. I still know that a lot of Victorian councils have never brought to account road formation as part of their valuations. The reality is those terms are engineering terms. They've got nothing to do with the accounting standards. In terms of replacement cost, again, this is to determine gross replacement cost, not current replacement cost. You have to assume that the asset would be replaced in the same location. It doesn't presently exist, but it takes into account all the costs that would necessarily be incurred, including the cost of demolition and replacement of assets that belong to third parties, and you have to assume you would do it based on what your normal practices are. So you have to apply judgment, have to include all your one-off costs, etc. And in terms of economic obsolescence, the simple way to look upon this is if you've got an asset which is over capacity, but you think down the track you might need that capacity, that is temporary obsolescence, there is no adjustment for it. But if you have overcapacity and you go, long term, I'm never going to need that, then that is overcapacity, that is obsolescence, and you need to reduce your replacement cost accordingly. So how should it be done? You need to split your asset into components. You then need to split each of those components into short life, long life parts. At the time of valuation, you then need to determine the fair value for each of those short life parts and long life parts based on condition, location, restrictions. Then you would add it all together to get your fair value. And for each of those short life and long life parts, they need to be depreciated using a method which matches the pattern of consumption. So that's it. And if you do that properly, I know this sounds like this is all complex, but if you do this properly, you get full integration with asset management, and then you can then drive projected renewals, capex, maintenance, develop strategic asset management plans at a click of a button. This is an output of what we do with our system, but it doesn't really matter whether you use our system or not. You should, if you do this properly, you're getting consistent data used for asset accounting and asset management. So I'm going to flick to the end because we're out of time. Just touching on that, we are going to do a webinar at some point in the next month. So if you've got questions, catch up with me at lunchtime. I've got to shoot off after lunch. Otherwise, log in for the webinar. Thank you.